I actually think all of these chronic diseases I've mentioned, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, I think they're all related, and they're all due to poor metabolism that's a result of poor diet.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean about, what do you mean with poor metabolism is a result of poor metabolism is a result of of a poor diet? Is that what you said?
That's right. Yeah. So when we talk about metabolic disease and those things
Mm-hmm.
that contribute to it, um, there's also something called metabolic syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
which you throw in what we call dyslipidemia, which was your good cholesterol is too low and your triglycerides, your fats in your blood are too high. So you add that in, then you have metabolic disease, and metabolic disease, will eventually lead to type 2 diabetes and or
Mm-hmm.
cancer and or cardiovascular disease. And in fact, we now think of Alzheimer's disease as a type 3 diabetes. So all of these are metabolic as opposed to, say, genetic,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there is a huge genetic component, of course. Your susceptibility to both acute and chronic disease is going to be somewhat dependent on the genes that you're given from your parents. But lifestyle has a huge impact on that. And again, most important of that is nutrition. So when you eat the present recommended diet in the West, which is a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, that is not a natural human diet. It's not our ancestral diet. It is the diet we've been eating for 10,000 years. So if you talk about, you're Spanish, I'm Canadian, you have your high carb foods that you eat and your sweet foods that you eat. And, in Canada, we have our macaroni and cheese and our pancakes and all that. So that all tastes good. And we have the notion that, a little bit now and then is okay. But in fact, the people don't do that a little bit now and then. They do it all the time. And so what we do now is we chronically eat a diet high in carbohydrate and low in fat. And that's what we've been told to do. What that does, carbohydrate really comes in sugars or complex carbohydrates, which are like starches and fiber. And of those, only the fiber really is beneficial. You don't need to eat any carbohydrate. You don't need to consume any of it. There are no essential carbohydrates in our diet. But that's where we get usually 2/3 to 3/4 of our calories is from that. And so what that does, all of that, aside from the fiber, turns into sugar in your blood sugar or glucose. And when you eat a whole lot of it, your blood sugar levels rise very rapidly. And then what happens is your body has to clear that sugar out of the blood because those are dangerously high levels. And it does so by releasing a very powerful hormone, perhaps the most powerful hormone, called insulin. And insulin has many effects. And one of them is to take that sugar out of the blood and deposit it into the muscles and the fat tissue and where it can be stored or used as a fuel. And the problem with that is when you're chronically eating a diet high in carbohydrate, you're chronically over secreting insulin. And we call that hyperinsulinemia, which means too much insulin in the blood. And over time, that hyperinsulinemia will eventually affect the receptors on those cells that allow the cells to absorb the sugar from the blood. We call this insulin resistance. And the effect on the receptors, we call that downregulation. In other words, because there's so much insulin in the blood, the cells become less responsive to it. And so in order for our bodies to get that sugar out, it now has to secrete more insulin. And then the cells become more resistant to it and more. And so over a period of maybe, it can happen more quickly, but typically over the period of a decade or so, we become insulin resistant. And your physician will see that in your blood work as a rising fasting level of blood glucose. So that's a metabolic response to that chronically high diet. Now, high insulin resistance and the high consumption of carbohydrate, that carbohydrate that can't be burned turns into fat. So now you have the insulin resistance, and elevated levels of sugar in the blood also cause inflammation in the blood. It's a little more complicated if you want to talk about that. But you have these three elements of the axis of illness. Think of a triangle with obesity on the bottom, insulin resistance at the top, and inflammation on the other side. And all of those three metabolic conditions make each other worse. So you get this vicious circle, or we call it positive feedback in physiology. And that will just get worse and worse and worse until eventually you'll get cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, or all of them, because we call them comorbidities. And just a sort of current addition to that is all of those conditions are also the ones that are creating the worst outcomes for COVID-19. And so if we can reverse those conditions, and we can with the ketogenic diet, for most people, I should mention, ketogenic diets aren't for everyone. There are some medical contraindications. They're rare, but you need to discuss that with your physician, and you should never make it's a significant metabolic change. So you should never make that change without consulting with your physician. But assuming it is, and about 7 out of 8 people respond positively, you can reverse those conditions, and sometimes very quickly. Typically within a month or so, you'll see great improvements. You'll start losing body fat, your blood sugar will start to regulate, your inflammatory markers in your blood will go down, your other biomarkers like your blood pressure and so on will improve. And we see this time and time again. It's very consistent. There's very, very good long-term, robust science to support this. So that's how making this change in your diet from going from we should probably talk about what a ketogenic diet is, but
Yes.
shifting from this high carbohydrate diet to a very low carbohydrate diet, in fact, almost a no carbohydrate diet outside of fiber, that's what allows you to make this metabolic improvement.